Tonight, humanity enters a battlefield already lost. 200 silent ships, no shields, no weapons, no engine flare, only darkness. And as the Supreme Leader Marshal Kharon prepares to erase them, the galaxy is about to learn that silence is not surrender.
The first thing that failed was not the engines. It was not the weapons. It was not even the hull. It was the silence. 200 human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of a battlefield already lost, and instead of the expected surge of energy signatures, instead of shield flares or weapon locks, they went dark. Completely dark. No emissions. No defensive grids. No targeting systems. Nothing. To every sensor in the system, they looked like drifting metal carcasses. And they were moving straight into the enemy fleet. Across the evacuation corridor, panic erupted instantly. Thousands of civilian vessels, refugees from a dozen shattered worlds, had been holding formation behind the last defensive line, watching the incoming armada with quiet terror. The enemy ships filled the void like a storm front, vast and unstoppable, their weapon arrays already glowing with contained annihilation. There had been no hope left. Not really. The humans were supposed to be that hope. Instead, they had just shut themselves off. What are they doing? Someone whispered over an open channel, the question spreading like a virus across every frequency. No one answered. Because no one understood. The enemy did. Or at least they thought they did. On the command bridge of the invading fleet, Supreme Marshal Karen studied the incoming human formation with mild curiosity, then with growing amusement. His species had crushed empires older than these newcomers, dismantled civilizations that had mastered every known form of warfare. Compared to them, humanity had always seemed unfinished, inefficient, obsessively mechanical in an age that had long abandoned such crude approaches. And now they had arrived, only to power down? A surrender gesture? One of his officers suggested. Karen leaned forward, watching the black shapes drift closer, unlit and unguarded. No, he said slowly. Surrender requires acknowledgement. His lips curled into something colder. This is confusion. The order went out across 800 warships at once. Target the human vessels. Full volley. The void lit up like the birth of a star. Energy lances, bright enough to blind, hot enough to strip atmospheres, tore across space in perfect synchronization. Thousands of beams converged on the silent human formation, a storm of fire that no shield could survive, no armor could endure. The kind of attack that ended wars before they truly began. Across the refugee fleet, people stopped breathing. Across the Allied defense line, commanders closed their eyes. The humans didn't react. No evasive maneuvers. No countermeasures. No shields. The beams hit. For a moment, everything disappeared in light. It should have been over in that instant. Every prediction, every simulation, every known law of warfare said the same thing. Those ships should have been vaporized, reduced to debris and radiation before the first second passed. Instead, something was still there. As the glare faded, the shapes emerged again, dark, intact, and still moving forward. No shields. No visible damage. No explanation. And then, impossibly, one of the human ships accelerated. The human ship did not accelerate like a vessel under power. There was no flare of engines, no distortion of space-time, no signature spike that sensors could track. It simply changed position, as if the void itself had shifted around it. One moment it was drifting among the others, cold and inert. The next, it had surged ahead of the formation, cutting a silent path toward the enemy line. Across the Allied fleet, confusion deepened into something sharper. Fear, yes, but also something else. A kind of dissonance. Because what they were seeing did not match any known behavior of a functioning warship. It didn't match panic. It didn't match surrender. It didn't even match recklessness. It felt deliberate. Are they malfunctioning? One commander asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. 200 ships did not fail in perfect synchronization. Behind him, the refugee convoy tightened formation instinctively, thousands of vessels clustering closer together as if proximity alone could offer protection. Civilian captains flooded the channels with questions that no one could answer. Why were the humans not defending themselves? Why had they come at all if this was their response? And why were they still advancing? On Karen's bridge, the amusement began to fade. The first volley should have erased the human fleet completely. Instead, his targeting displays showed 200 intact signatures continuing forward, unchanged in structure, unchanged in velocity. The data scrolled past again and again, each scan confirming the same impossible result. No debris fields, his tactical officer reported, voice tightening. No hull breaches detected. Energy dissipation readings are inconsistent. Karen's gaze sharpened. Define inconsistent. The officer hesitated. The energy is not reflecting. It's not dispersing. It's disappearing. That was not possible. Energy did not vanish. It transferred, transformed, or destroyed, but it did not simply cease to exist. Karen watched as another wave of human ships shifted formation, spreading out in a pattern that made no tactical sense. They were not clustering for defense. They were not flanking for attack. They were placing themselves, carefully, precisely, at irregular intervals, forming a loose, almost fragile lattice in the void. "What are they doing?" someone murmured. For the first time, Karen did not have an answer. Across the battlefield, a message flashed through Allied command channels, originating from the lead human vessel. It was brief. No encryption. No elaboration. Hold position. Do not engage. That was it. No explanation. No reassurance. Just an order. The response was immediate and divided. Some commanders obeyed without hesitation. Others protested openly, demanding clarification, accusing the humans of madness or incompetence. A few even began quietly repositioning their ships, preparing to retreat if the situation collapsed completely. Because from their perspective, it already had. The enemy fleet was still intact. Still advancing. Still preparing another strike. And the humans, whatever they were doing it without weapons.
So far, the refugee fleet is trapped. The enemy armada is advancing, and humanity has arrived in the strangest way imaginable. Dark, silent, and refusing to fire. Charon believes he is watching confusion, but those human ships are positioning themselves for something no one on this battlefield understands yet.
Charon did not wait for a third volley. "Fire again," he ordered, this time with a trace of irritation cutting through his calm. "Increase output. Saturate the formation." The second barrage was even more devastating than the first. More ships joined the firing line. More energy poured into the void. This time, the beams did not simply strike. They enveloped the human fleet, swallowing it in a storm of annihilation that lingered, sustained, overwhelming. If anything could break them, this would. Sensors strained to keep up. Data feeds overloaded with conflicting readings. Thermal spikes rose beyond measurable limits. Space itself seemed to ripple under the intensity. And still, no explosions. No fragmentation. No signs of collapse. When the energy finally dissipated, the human ships were still there. Closer now. Closer than they should have been. Closer than physics allowed. A ripple of unease spread through the enemy command structure, subtle but undeniable. It was not fear, not yet, but it was the first crack in certainty. Because something was wrong. Not just unexpected. Wrong. Karen leaned forward slowly, eyes fixed on the advancing formation. "Scan their propulsion systems," he said. "Now." The results came back seconds later. No active drives detected. "Scan again." "We have, Commander." There are no emissions. No reaction signatures. No mass displacement patterns consistent with thrust. Karen's expression hardened. Ships without propulsion did not move. Ships without power did not survive sustained bombardment. Ships without shields did not exist on a battlefield like this. And yet, they were here. Still advancing. Still silent. Then one of his officers spoke again, quieter this time. "Commander, there's something else." Karen did not look away from the display. "Report." The officer swallowed. "We're detecting localized distortions forming between our forward units. They're small. barely measurable. But they weren't there before. Distortions? Karen repeated. Yes, Commander. Gravitational in nature. But unstable. Like something is being placed or anchored. The words hung in the air. Place. Anchored. Karen's gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, back to the human formation. The strange spacing, the deliberate positioning, the silent advance. Not confusion. Not surrender. Not malfunction. Something else. Something that had already begun. And suddenly, for the first time since the war started, Karen felt the faintest edge of uncertainty. Because if the humans had not come to fight the way everyone expected, then what exactly had they come to do? The distortions were small at first, so small that most systems ignored them as background noise. Tiny fluctuations in gravitational readings, appearing for fractions of a second and then stabilizing into something almost undetectable. They did not behave like weapons. They did not behave like natural phenomena. They behaved like they belonged there. Map them, Karen ordered, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Across the enemy fleet, sensor arrays recalibrated, pushing beyond standard thresholds, filtering out interference, isolating anomalies. What emerged was not chaos. It was structure. The distortions formed a pattern. Not random. Not reactive. Intentional. They stretched across the forward edge of the battlefield in a loose, expanding grid, aligned, disturbingly, with the positions the human ships had taken minutes earlier. Karen felt something shift inside him, something old and instinctive. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. This was not a malfunction. It was not a defensive system. It was preparation. Cease fire, he said abruptly. The order rippled through the fleet, cutting off the third barrage before it could fully form. Weapons dimmed, energy levels dropped, and for the first time since the engagement began, the battlefield fell into a strange, unnatural quiet. The human ships did not react. They continued forward, drifting into the spaces they had created, each one settling into position with unnerving precision. Still no shields. Still no visible power. Still no explanation. Across the Allied fleet, the silence was unbearable. "They're not fighting," one officer whispered, disbelief threading through every word. "They're building something." But what? No one had an answer. The refugee convoy watched from behind, caught between hope and terror. They had expected a battle, something violent, something familiar. Instead, they were witnessing something they could not interpret, something that refused to fit into any known category of warfare. And the worst part was, it was working. The enemy fleet had stopped firing. Karen stood motionless, studying the expanding lattice of distortions. His tactical mind ran through possibilities at impossible speed, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. Mines? Too precise. Too stable. Field generators? Impossible without detectable power. Some form of cloaked weapon? Whatever this was, it did not behave like a weapon waiting to be triggered. It behaved like a system already active. "Probe one of the distortions," he ordered. A forward drone detached from the nearest warship, its small frame accelerating toward the closest anomaly. It moved cautiously at first, sensors extended, scanning every wavelength, every field interaction. For a moment, nothing happened. The drone hovered at the edge of the distortion, transmitting data back to the fleet. The readings were wrong. Space-time curvature was present, but not in any configuration the systems could interpret. It was as if the laws governing the distortion had been rewritten locally, subtly, but fundamentally. "Move closer," Karen said. The drone complied. It crossed the boundary. And vanished. Not destroyed. Not disrupted. Gone. No explosion. No debris. No energy spike. Just absence. Across the bridge, every officer froze. "Where did it go?" someone asked, the question barely audible. The sensors searched for it, scanning beyond the immediate area, extending outward, looking for any trace of mass displacement, any sign of translation or transmission. There was nothing. The drone had not been destroyed. It had been removed. Karen felt the edge of that uncertainty sharpen into something colder. Deploy a second probe, he said, more controlled this time. Maintain distance. Do not cross the boundary. The second drone approached, halting just outside the distortion. Its sensors reached in, probing the edge, measuring the transition point. And then the data feed spiked. Commander, the tactical officer said, voice tight, the distortion is increasing. Define increasing. It's expanding. Slowly but consistently. The boundary is moving. Karen's eyes flicked back to the human ships. They had stopped advancing. Every vessel now held position, perfectly aligned within the lattice they had created. Still silent. Still dark. Waiting. For what? Across the battlefield, the distortions began to shift, not violently, not unpredictably, but with a kind of controlled inevitability. The grid tightened, each point drawing slightly closer to the others, the space between them compressing in ways that defied conventional geometry. Ships near the edges of the formation began to experience it first. Minor course deviations. Subtle gravitational pulls that interfered with navigation systems. Nothing catastrophic, yet, but enough to disrupt formation integrity. Adjust positioning, Karen ordered. Maintain spacing. The fleet responded instantly, engines firing, ships shifting to compensate. But the distortions adjusted with them. Always maintaining alignment. Always closing in. They're tracking us, one officer said, realization dawning. Not targeting, tracking. Karen did not respond. Because he was already seeing it. The lattice was not static. It was adaptive. And it was centered on his fleet. Across the Allied lines, the confusion had transformed into something else entirely. They're trapping them, someone whispered, the words carrying across open channels, spreading through the fleet like a shockwave. But even that felt insufficient. This was not a trap in any traditional sense. There were no weapons firing, no barriers forming, no visible constraints. And yet the enemy fleet was no longer in control of its own movement. For the first time, the balance of the battlefield had shifted. Not through force. Through something far more unsettling. Understanding. Karen clenched his jaw, his mind racing, searching for a countermeasure, a flaw, anything that could break the pattern forming around him. Full reverse thrust, he ordered. Pull the fleet back beyond the distortion field. Engines roared to life across hundreds of ships, pushing against the invisible pressure building in the void. For a moment, it seemed to work. The outermost vessels began to drift backward, inching away from the tightening grid. And then the distortions reacted. Not faster. Not stronger. Smarter. The lattice shifted again, reconfiguring in real time, adjusting its geometry to compensate for the movement, closing gaps before they could widen, tightening the invisible net around the fleet. The ships did not stop moving. But they were no longer escaping. They were being guided. Karen's certainty finally broke. Because whatever the humans had deployed, it was not just controlling space. It was controlling the outcome. And they had activated it long before the first shot was fired. The first ship to break was not destroyed. To bend. At the far edge of the formation, a heavy cruiser attempted a full thrust escape, engines pushing past safety limits, its hull groaning under the strain. For a fraction of a second, it seemed to succeed. It moved, truly moved, beyond the tightening distortions. Then space folded. Not violently. Not explosively. Quietly. The cruiser elongated along its own axis, its structure stretching into something impossible, as if it had been pulled between two conflicting realities. There was no fire, no rupture, no debris. Just a slow, silent distortion of matter itself until the ship simply unraveled. And vanished. No wreckage. No signal. Nothing. Across Karen's fleet, something far more dangerous than fear began to spread. Disbelief. Report, he snapped, but the word lacked its former authority. Structural integrity failure, an officer said, though the explanation sounded hollow even to them. No known weapon signature. No energy discharge. It's as if the ship ceased to exist. Another finished, voice trembling. Karen's claws tightened against the command rail. Then we do not escape through force, he said sharply. We adapt. But even as he spoke, the distortions shifted again. Closer now. Not rushing. Not accelerating. Just inevitable. The grid had begun to contract with purpose, each point of distortion aligning more tightly around key positions in the fleet, subtly isolating ships from one another. Communication lag increased. Targeting systems flickered. Navigation solutions returned contradictory data. Space itself had become unreliable. Across the Allied fleet, what had begun as confusion had now transformed into something dangerously close to panic. "They're not attacking," one commander said, voice rising. "They're erasing them." Another cut in, "If that field expands, if it reaches us." It was not finished, but it didn't need to be. Everyone understood. The humans had not created a battlefield. They had created a boundary. And no one knew how far it would spread. "Human command, respond," a senior Allied admiral transmitted, unable to hold back any longer. "What have you deployed? Is this contained? Are we in danger?" For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the same calm human signal returned. "Hold position." Nothing else. No reassurance. No explanation. Just the same command, repeated. On the refugee channels, the reaction was immediate. Fear spiked, voices overlapping, some begging for evacuation clearance, others demanding immediate retreat from the entire sector. Civilian ships began to drift backward despite orders, instinct overriding coordination. Because whatever this was, it didn't look like salvation anymore. It looked like something far worse. Karen saw it too. He saw the hesitation in his fleet, the slight delays in execution, the fractures forming in perfect discipline. That was something he understood, and it was something he could use. "All units," he said, voice cutting through the chaos with renewed clarity, "concentrate fire on the human vessels. Ignore the distortions. They are constructs. The source is the ships." It was a gamble, but it was the only one left. Weapons reignited across the fleet, brighter, more focused, more desperate. This time, the targeting was precise. No wide volleys, no saturation. Every beam, every lance, every particle stream converged on individual human ships. If the system depended on them, then they would break it. The void lit up again. But this time, something changed. The beam struck and did not disappear. They bent, subtly at first. Barely perceptible shifts in trajectory, like light passing through an invisible lens. Then more dramatically, curving away from their intended targets, sliding along unseen gradients, deflected into empty space or redirected into neighboring distortions. A few made contact. They hit the human hulls with full force. And still, nothing. No penetration. No damage. Only a faint, dull glow spreading across the surface before fading. "Impossible," someone whispered on Karen's bridge. He didn't respond. Because he was already seeing the truth unfold in front of him. The distortions weren't just surrounding the fleet. They were interacting with everything inside them. Energy. Matter. Motion. All of it. "Commander," the tactical officer said, voice tightening further, "the field density is increasing. It's no longer localized, we're reading overlap between distortion points." Overlap. Karen's eyes snapped back to the display. The grid was no longer a grid. It was becoming continuous. The gaps between distortions were shrinking, merging, forming a single, unified structure, a warped region of space that no longer obeyed standard geometry. And his fleet was inside it. Fully inside it. "Reverse all vectors," he ordered immediately. "All ships, maximum thrust in every direction. Break formation. Scatter." This time, there was no discipline. Only survival. Ships surged outward, engines flaring, formations collapsing as commanders abandoned cohesion for escape. It should have worked. With enough directional variance, at least some vessels should have broken free. None did. Every path curved. Every trajectory bent. Every escape route returned. Like a maze with no exit. The realization hit all at once. They were not being surrounded. They were being contained. Across the Allied fleet, silence fell again, but it was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of understanding. They planned this, someone said quietly. Before they even arrived, they planned all of it. And still, the humans had not fired a single shot. Karen felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. But the certainty of control, slipping. Because whatever this was, it was not a battle anymore. And whatever came next, they were already too late to stop it. The first detonation did not come from a weapon. It came from inside the fleet. One of Karen's forward destroyers surged suddenly with energy, its core spiking far beyond operational limits without any command input. For a brief, impossible moment, its systems fought to stabilize, alarms cascading across every console. Then the ship collapsed inward. Not exploded. Not torn apart. Compressed. Its entire structure folded into itself as if gravity had been multiplied 1,000 times over in a single instant. Hull, crew, reactor, all crushed into a point smaller than the ship's own command chamber. And then it was gone. No debris. No radiation. Only a ripple. The ripple spread outward, distorting nearby vessels, dragging at them, warping their trajectories, pulling them slightly off course before releasing them again. Across the fleet, chaos ignited. What was that? Internal failure? No, external influence, something triggered it. Karen didn't shout this time. He watched. Because the pattern was becoming visible. Another ship. Then another. Not random. Sequential. Each collapse occurring at a precise interval, each one slightly closer to the center of the distortion field than the last. Like a chain reaction, but one governed not by proximity, by design. They're not attacking, Karen said slowly, the realization settling in like a blade. They're activating. No one answered. Because deep down they knew he was right. Across the battlefield, the distortions intensified. What had once been subtle anomalies were now undeniable forces. Space twisted visibly, light bending at unnatural angles, entire regions of the void appearing, stretched, compressed, misaligned. And still, the human ships remained silent. Stationary. Waiting. Across the Allied fleet, disbelief turned into something else entirely. They built this, one admiral whispered, barely able to process it. They built this before the battle even started. That was the truth of it. The humans hadn't come to fight the enemy fleet. They had come to rewrite the battlefield itself. The next collapse came faster. A cruiser this time. Then 3 ships at once. Each one folding inward, vanishing without resistance, their mass seemingly erased from existence. Yet the distortions grew stronger with every loss. "Commander!" the tactical officer shouted, no longer able to maintain composure. "The field is feeding on mass displacement. Every collapse is strengthening it." Karen's gaze sharpened instantly. Feeding. That meant it wasn't just a trap. It was evolving. "Then stop losing ships," he snapped. "Stabilize positions. Shut down all non-essential systems. Reduce energy output." "Commander, it's not energy-based," the officer interrupted. "It's reacting to mass, momentum, gravitational variance. We can't." Another ship collapsed mid-sentence. This time, the ripple was stronger. Nearby vessels were dragged several kilometers off course before stabilizing, their formations completely shattered. Navigation systems failed outright, unable to reconcile conflicting spatial data. There was no longer a stable direction. Only distortion. Across the fleet, panic took hold. Orders were delayed. Responses faltered. Ships moved erratically, some accelerating blindly, others attempting to hold position, all of them fighting a battlefield that no longer followed any known rule. Karen remained still. Not because he was calm, but because he understood something the others didn't. This wasn't happening now. It had already happened. The humans had placed every piece of this system before the first shot was fired. The distortions, the alignment, the positioning of their ships, it had all been part of a larger structure. A structure that was only now revealing itself. "They baited us," he said quietly. No one asked him to clarify. "They needed us inside the field. Needed us to commit fully. To engage. To anchor ourselves." His claws tightened again, but not in anger. in realization. And we did. Across the battlefield, the human fleet finally moved again. Not forward, not backward, inward. Each ship shifted slightly within the lattice, adjusting position with surgical precision. The spacing between them tightened, not randomly, but in direct response to the collapsing enemy ships. Like nodes aligning, completing something. "Commander," the tactical officer whispered, voice hollow now. "The distortions, they're connecting." Karen looked, and for the first time he saw the full shape of it. The grid, the lattice, the anomalies. They were no longer separate. They had merged into a single, continuous structure. A vast, invisible construct spanning the entire battlefield. The construct that bent space, controlled motion, redirected force, and now consumed mass. The enemy fleet wasn't being attacked. It was being processed. The realization hit the bridge like a shockwave. "This isn't a weapon," someone said. Karen shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "This is infrastructure." And they were trapped inside it. Another series of collapses rippled through the fleet, faster now, closer together, accelerating in frequency. Ships vanished in seconds, entire squadrons destabilized, pulled apart by forces they couldn't counter, couldn't even fully detect. Across the Allied lines, silence returned once more. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was understanding. The humans had never needed to fire. Because the moment the enemy fleet entered the battlefield, the outcome had already been decided. And the worst part, they still didn't know how it worked. Karen refused to accept inevitability. "Reconfigure the fleet," he ordered, voice cutting through the chaos with renewed force. "All ships, cut engines. Match drift. Eliminate momentum variance." It was a desperate command, but not a blind one. If the field reacted to motion, to mass displacement, then stillness might be the only form of resistance left. Across what remained of the fleet, engines powered down one by one. Massive warships that had once carved through space like blades now drifted in forced silence, their crews holding breath as if even the act of movement might trigger annihilation. For a moment, it worked. The distortion stabilized. The collapse chain slowed. Ships that had been moments from structural failure held together, their hulls groaning but intact. The violent ripples that had torn through formations began to fade into something more contained, more predictable. On Karen's bridge, a flicker of control returned. "Maintain this state," he said, quieter now. "No thrust. No rotation. No system fluctuations beyond minimum." He watched the lattice carefully. It had not disappeared. But it had paused. And that meant one thing. It wasn't unstoppable. It could be influenced. Across the battlefield, the human fleet remained motionless, their ships now perfectly aligned within the structure they had created. They made no attempt to interfere. No signals. No warnings. No reaction. Just observation. That silence was worse than any weapon. Because it meant they were waiting. "Commander," the tactical officer said slowly, staring at the incoming data, "the field isn't weakening." Karen didn't look away. "Explain." "It's adapting. The stabilization is temporary. The distortions are recalibrating around our reduced motion profile." Of course they were. Karen's jaw tightened. This system wasn't reactive in a simple sense. It was learning, adjusting, compensating for every attempt to counter it. They were not fighting a static trap. They were inside something that evolved in real time. Across the fleet, tension returned, thicker now, heavier. Crews sat in silence, hands hovering over controls they could not use, waiting for something they could not predict. Then it came. Not with violence. With pressure. Subtle at first. A shift in spatial orientation that could not be measured but could be felt. Ships that had been drifting smoothly now began to experience resistance, not from engines, not from external force, but from the space around them itself. Like moving through something that wasn't empty anymore. "Structural stress increasing," one officer reported. "Hull integrity stable, but strain patterns are rising." The distortions were changing again. Not collapsing ships this time. Compressing them. Slowly. Deliberately. "Commander," the tactical officer said, voice tightening further. The field is no longer relying on motion triggers. It's building internal pressure gradients. Karen understood instantly. They had adapted. Stillness was no longer safety. It was vulnerability. Restart engines, he ordered immediately. Full maneuvering. Break the pressure zones before they stabilize. The fleet responded, but too late. The moment engines flared, the field reacted. Not violently. Precisely. Every ignition point, every shift in thrust, every attempt to break free was mapped instantly into the structure. The distortions surged, not outward but inward, locking onto each movement, amplifying it, feeding off it. The battlefield snapped back into chaos. Ships jerked out of position, dragged along invisible vectors, their trajectories bending in impossible arcs. Some collided, not with each other, but with warped sections of space that resisted their movement like solid barriers. One ship attempted a full burn escape. It accelerated, and reappeared seconds later exactly where it had started. Not teleported. Returned. Like space itself had looped. "What is this?" someone shouted over the command channel. "We're not moving, we're being redirected." Karen's claws dug into the console hard enough to crack the surface. This wasn't just containment anymore. It was control. Absolute, system-level control over every variable that mattered. Mass, momentum, position, even direction. Across the Allied fleet, the realization hit just as hard. "They're not fighting them," one commander said, voice hollow with awe. "They're controlling the rules." And for the first time, the scale of what humanity had done began to fully emerge. This wasn't a battlefield advantage. This wasn't superior technology in the conventional sense. This was a complete rejection of how war had been fought for thousands of years. While every other species had built stronger weapons, humans had asked a different question. What if you didn't need to fight at all? Back in the enemy formation, Karen forced his mind to cut through the shock. There had to be a weakness. There was always a weakness. "No system is perfect," he said quietly. "Find the anchor points." The tactical officer blinked. "Anchor points?" "The origin nodes," Karen clarified. "The structures maintaining the field. This entire construct requires stability. It must be anchored somewhere." The officer hesitated, then began scanning. Moments later, the data appeared. And for the first time since the battle began, something resembling opportunity surfaced. "Commander, the human ships." Karen's eyes narrowed. "They are the anchors," the officer continued. "Each vessel is positioned at a convergence point. They're not just inside the field, they're holding it in place." Of course. It made sense. The lattice, the alignment, the precision, it all traced back to them. Destroy the anchors, and the system collapses. Karen straightened slowly, the weight of inevitability shifting, just slightly. "All ships," he said, voice returning to full command authority, "new priority target. Human vessels only. Concentrate all remaining firepower." The fleet responded immediately. Not with confidence, but with desperation. Because this was the last chance. Across the void, weapons powered up once more. Less organized now, less controlled, but still deadly. Every remaining ship focused everything it had on the silent human formation. For the first time, the humans moved. Not outward, not away, but deeper into the structure. And for the first time since their arrival, their ships began to glow. The glow wasn't energy. That was the first thing the enemy sensors confirmed, and the last thing anyone expected. It didn't radiate outward like power buildup. It didn't spike across the spectrum like weapon activation. Instead, it settled across the surface of each human ship like a shifting layer, faint and controlled, as if something beneath the hull had finally been allowed to surface. And then the distortions changed again. Not wider, deeper. The entire field compressed inward, not just around the enemy fleet, but through it. Space no longer behaved like a medium. It behaved like a mechanism. Every ship caught within it became part of a system they could neither see nor influence. Karen didn't hesitate. Fire. Everything they had left surged forward. Not a coordinated volley. Not a disciplined strike. A final attempt. Beams, lances, pulses, every remaining weapon discharged at once, converging on the glowing human vessels that anchored the impossible construct. This time, the attacks didn't bend. They didn't vanish. They connected. The first impact struck the lead human ship dead center. For a fraction of a second, it looked like reality had returned. Energy flooded across the hull, overwhelming, saturating, exactly as it should have. The kind of force that had shattered fleets and ended civilizations. Across Karen's bridge, a flicker of hope ignited. Then the energy slowed. Not dispersed. Slowed. Like it had entered something denser than matter, something that resisted not through force, but through structure. The beam compressed against the surface, its velocity bleeding away, its intensity folding inward instead of outward. And then, it stopped. Completely. Suspended. Held in place against the hull like a frozen stream of light. No explosion. No damage. Just containment. Every weapon that struck did the same. Hundreds of attacks, held, trapped, immobilized against the human ships, forming a halo of captured destruction that never reached its target. Karen's hope died instantly. Impossible, someone whispered. But Karen didn't speak. Because he understood now. They weren't blocking the attacks. They were absorbing the outcome. Across the battlefield, the human fleet moved again. Not repositioning. Not maneuvering. Synchronizing. Every ship shifted by fractions, microscopic adjustments that aligned perfectly with the tightening distortion field. The glow intensified, spreading across the formation, linking ship to ship in ways no sensor could fully interpret. The anchors were no longer just holding the structure. They were completing it. "Commander," the tactical officer said, voice barely steady, "the field is reaching critical density. If it increases any further..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone could feel it. Space had become heavy. Movement resisted itself. Even light seemed slower. The battlefield was collapsing, not inward, not outward, but into something else entirely. Karen's mind raced, pushing past fear, past shock, into the only place left, decision. If the anchors held the system, then they had to fall. "Ramming protocols," he said. The bridge went silent. "Commander," one officer asked, unsure they had heard correctly. "You heard me," Karen replied, voice cold, absolute. "All remaining ships. Maximum thrust. Direct collision with human vessels. If weapons cannot destroy them, mass will." It was suicide. They all knew it. But it was also the only variable left. The only force the humans hadn't neutralized completely. Mass in motion. Momentum with intent. Across the fleet, engines roared back to life, overdriven, uncontrolled, pushing ships beyond structural limits as they hurled themselves toward the glowing human formation. The distortions reacted instantly. Trajectories bent. Vectors twisted. But not completely. Not perfectly. A few ships, just a few, cut through the shifting field, their paths unstable but still forward, still closing distance. Across the Allied lines, shock turned to horror. They're going to hit them. They'll break the system. Humans respond. "You need to move." No response. The human fleet did not evade. Did not retreat. Did not even acknowledge the incoming threat. They held position. Waiting. The first enemy ship broke through. A massive cruiser, its hull already fracturing under the strain of distorted space, engines screaming as it tore toward the nearest human vessel. Impact was seconds away. On Karen's bridge, every eye locked onto the display. If this worked, if even one anchor failed, the entire structure might collapse. The cruiser closed the final distance. 1 second. Half a second. And then, it stopped. Not gradually. Not through resistance. Instantly. Frozen in space, its forward momentum erased so completely it was as if it had never moved at all. Its hull remained intact. Its engine still burned. But it did not advance another centimeter. It hung there, suspended, caught between motion and stillness, between force and absence. Then the distortion surged. Not outward. Inward. And the cruiser folded. Silently. Effortlessly. gone. The remaining ships never reached their targets. Every one of them stopped. Every one of them vanished. And across the battlefield, something shifted. Not in the enemy fleet. Not in the Allied lines. In the humans. Because for the first time, they acted with finality. The glow across their ships pulsed once. And the entire field locked into place.
Now the truth has become terrifying. The humans were never trying to win a normal battle. They built a lattice, anchored it with their own chips, bent motion, swallowed attacks, erased charging cruisers, and finally locked the entire field into place. Heron's fleet is no longer fighting humanity. It is trapped inside humanity's rules.
The pulse did not explode outward. It sank inward. Every distortion, every invisible force, every warped fragment of space converged at once, not collapsing the battlefield, but sealing it. The chaotic lattice that had twisted and adapted throughout the fight suddenly became absolute, like a lock snapping shut after a long, deliberate turn. And then, everything stopped. Not just movement. Everything. Enemy ships hung in place, frozen in impossible orientations. Some mid-turn. Some mid-burn. Some caught in the act of firing, their weapons locked in silent, unfinished discharge. Even the light around them seemed fixed, stretched into faint streaks that no longer moved. Across the Allied fleet, sensors struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Time hadn't stopped. But inside that field, something close to it had. Status, an Allied commander asked, voice barely steady. No one answered immediately because there was no framework for the answer. The enemy fleet still existed, but it no longer functioned. Every system was trapped inside a state of unresolved motion. Forces applied but never completed, energy released but never transferred. The ships were intact, but meaningless. Perfectly preserved, and completely defeated. On the human command channel, a signal finally came through. Direct. Unhurried. Engagement complete. That was it. No celebration. No explanation. Just a statement. Across the battlefield, the distortions began to fade, not collapsing violently, not releasing their hold all at once, but dissolving gradually, as if the structure itself no longer needed to exist. One by one, the frozen enemy ships changed. Not back into motion. Into absence. They didn't explode. They didn't break apart. They simply ceased. Like equations resolving to zero. Mass vanished. Energy dissipated. Entire vessels erased cleanly from existence, leaving behind nothing, not even debris to mark where they had been. Within minutes, the vast armada that had once threatened to consume entire civilizations was gone. Completely. Silence returned to the void. But it was no longer the silence of fear. It was something heavier. Reverence. Across the Allied fleet, no one spoke for a long time. Commanders, soldiers, civilians, all of them stared into the empty space where the enemy had stood, trying to process what they had just witnessed. There had been no battle. No exchange. No victory in the way they understood it. Just removal. They didn't win, one voice said quietly over a private channel. Another answered just as softly. No, they decided. That was the difference. The humans hadn't fought for control of the battlefield. They had taken control of the rules that defined it. Slowly, the human ships powered up again. Not dramatically. Not with any show of force. Just enough to exist. Energy signatures returned, faint and controlled. Systems came online one by one. To outside observers, it looked almost ordinary. As if the impossible thing they had just done required no more effort than routine maintenance. The lead human vessel moved forward, crossing the space where the enemy fleet had once stood. No debris fields. No radiation clouds. No wreckage. Just empty stars. A channel opened, this time directed to the Allied command. "You are clear," the human commander said. Her voice was calm, steady, unchanged by what had just happened. "Evacuation route is secure." An Allied admiral finally found his voice. What was that? There was a pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. Then the answer came. A correction. Nothing more. The channel closed. Across the refugee fleet, movement slowly resumed. Ships began to accelerate, one by one, slipping through the cleared corridor toward safety. Families who had expected to die now watched the stars open before them, unable to fully grasp how close they had come to annihilation, or how completely it had been erased. Hope spread, but it was different now. Not fragile. Not desperate. Certain. Because something had changed. Not just in the balance of power. In the understanding of it. Back on Karen's bridge, what remained of it, there was no panic. No chaos. Only silence. The Supreme Marshal stood alone, staring at the empty void where his fleet had been. His command systems were dead. His communications silent. His empire, reduced to nothing in a matter of moments. He had not been captured. He had not been spared. He had been excluded. Left outside the system that had erased everything else. A witness. Nothing more. For the first time in his life, Karen understood something his people had never needed to consider. Strength was not dominance. Power was not force. And superiority was not guaranteed. Somewhere behind him, systems flickered weakly back to life. Emergency protocols. Survival functions. Nothing more. He didn't turn. Didn't move. Because the realization had already settled. They had not been defeated. They had been outgrown. Far beyond the battlefield, beyond the dying echoes of war, the human fleet reformed into quiet formation, their ships once again unremarkable against the vastness of space. No monuments. No declarations. Just presence. They had arrived when called. They had ended what needed ending. And now, they remained. Not as conquerors. Not as rulers. But as something far more unsettling to those who still believed in power as it once was. A species that didn't just fight wars. A species that decided when they were over. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, the rest of the galaxy began to understand. Humanity had not risen to dominate. They had risen to redefine what dominance even meant.
In the end, humanity's power had not bigger guns or stronger shields. It was understanding. They saved the refugee, removed the armada, left Charon as a witness, and showed the galaxy a new kind of strength, not conquest, not cruelty, but the ability to end war itself.